When the hunt begins, the hunters aren't always the ones in control. From a longbow archer facing a 1,000 pound grizzly to a deer charging a frosty stand in Wisconsin, from a midnight bear massacre in Russia to a Kodiak smashing into a truck, from a raging boar plowing through hunters in Tuscany to a mountain lion ambushing a father and son in Colorado, each encounter shows how fast predator and prey can trade places. Watch till the end, because survival often comes down to seconds. In early September 2025, the wilderness of Montana was alive with the sound of rushing rivers and the heavy scent of spawning salmon. Along one of these remote waterways, veteran bow hunter Cole Jensen moved with practiced care. His camouflage blended into the trees, and his gear was chosen for silence. Every detail mattered. His scent-blocking layers, his quiver filled with broadheads, and his years of experience reading sign and tracking large animals. Cole had hunted for decades, but on this day, he faced a challenge unlike most others. A grizzly that weighed nearly half a ton. He had tracked the bear along the bends of the river, following fresh prints that pressed deep into the mud. Claw marks scarred the banks where the beast had dug for fish. Cole knew this was no ordinary encounter. A grizzly of this size could crush a man in seconds, yet he pressed on, confident in his skill with a longbow. His plan was simple: wait downwind, stay hidden, and strike with precision when the moment was right. Cole positioned himself behind a fallen log, heart pounding but hands steady. At 20 yards, the grizzly appeared. Its massive frame moved with raw power as it tore salmon from the water, the sound of bones crunching echoing through the valley. Cole drew an arrow, the string tight against his cheek, and released. The broadhead struck the bear's shoulder with a thud. The animal reared up, bellowing in rage, its roar shaking the trees. The charge came fast, a blur of fur and fury crashing through the brush. Cole loosed another arrow, then a third, then a fourth. Some hit muscle, others deflected off bone, each one failing to stop the massive predator. The ground shook under its weight as it closed the distance. Cole had only seconds. The bear swiped, claws slashing across his arm and chest, sending him sprawling backward. His jacket shredded, his forearm torn open, pain flaring hot and sharp. Air rushed from his lungs as his ribs cracked against the ground. Instinct took over. He rolled behind a tree, gripping the bough with bloodied hands, heart hammering in his ears. The grizzly circled, roaring and pawing the earth, its eyes fixed on him. Cole knocked his final arrow, every muscle straining despite the pain. He waited until the bear lunged again, its bulk filling his vision, and then he released. The broadhead struck deep into the vitals. The beast staggered, stumbling as it let out a final roar that echoed across the valley. For a long moment it swayed on its legs, then collapsed heavily into the brush, the ground trembling under its fall. Cole, battered and bleeding, pressed his back to the tree, trying to steady his breath as the silence of the wilderness returned. Cole leaned against the tree, his body shaking as the pain spread through every bone and muscle. His chest throbbed with each shallow breath, and the torn flesh on his arm burned with every heartbeat. The forest around him was silent now, the roar of the grizzly replaced by the steady rush of the river. The massive bear lay motionless in the brush, its bulk still and heavy against the earth. The fight was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. He tried to push himself upright, but the fractured ribs sent a sharp wave through his body, forcing him back down. Every movement was a test of will. The bough rested on the ground beside him, its string frayed from the frantic shots he had loosed. His jacket was shredded, stained dark with blood, and his hands trembled as he pressed them against the wounds to slow the flow. The cold air bit at the open gashes, but it also numbed them just enough for him to think clearly again. Cole forced himself to crawl to the riverbank, dragging his battered body inch by inch. The water was frigid, but he dipped strips of cloth into it and pressed them against his cuts. The icy sting was unbearable, yet it slowed the bleeding. He fashioned a crude bandage from torn layers of his clothing, binding his arm and chest as tightly as his shaking fingers would allow. Survival depended not only on strength, but on the ability to act with calm, even when fear and pain threatened to consume him. The carcass of the grizzly loomed nearby, a grim reminder of how close he had come to death. Its sheer size made it seem less like an animal and more like a force of nature, something unstoppable until the very last arrow had struck true. Cole studied it through blurred vision, realizing how narrow the line had been between victory and tragedy. The broadheads had done their work, but it had taken every arrow, every ounce of focus, and nearly every drop of his strength. Hours passed before he managed to stumble back toward camp, his steps uneven and slow. The brush tore at his torn clothing, and every shift of weight on his ribs brought fresh waves of pain. When he finally reached the fire ring he had prepared earlier that day, he collapsed beside it, too weak to gather wood. Still, he managed to spark a small flame, its glow offering warmth and a fragile sense of safety. When guides arrived later, drawn by the sound of shots and the trail of broken brush, they found him pale and trembling but alive. They tended his wounds quickly, marveling at the massive grizzly that lay only yards from where he had fought for his life. His survival became a story told with hushed respect, not only for his skill but for his resolve in the face of overwhelming danger. For Cole, the scars would remain long after the pain faded. The fractured ribs would heal, the torn flesh would knit back together. But the memory of that moment, when a single misstep or a weaker pull on the bowstring could have ended everything, would stay carved into his mind forever. The wilderness had tested him, and though he survived, he carried its mark as proof of both his courage and its unforgiving power. In late November 2024, the woods of northern Wisconsin lay under a thick layer of frost, the air sharp and still in the early morning light. The forest seemed frozen in time, every pine needle coated with ice crystals, every breath hanging heavy in the cold air. Hunter Sam Fletcher sat high in his tree stand, layered in camo and insulated gloves, his body still but alert. Beside him, in another stand across the narrow game trail, his brother Nate watched the clearing with the same quiet patience. Both had prepared for weeks, cleaning gear, masking their scent, and studying the well-worn path carved by deer that moved through this valley each winter. Sam carried a .50 caliber inline muzzleloader, its weight steady in his hands. The clearing below stretched white with frost, every sound sharp in the silence. Hours passed, broken only by the rustle of wind through the branches. Then movement stirred the shadows. A mature 8-point buck stepped out, its breath steaming in the cold, flanked by a doe and 2 fawns. Their presence was quiet yet commanding, the buck's antlers glistening faintly in the pale light. Sam steadied his aim, muscles tightening as he drew focus. When the shot cracked, it echoed like thunder through the still air. The broadside strike landed on the buck's shoulder, but instead of dropping, the animal jolted in panic. Its hooves tore through the frost-bitten ground as it bolted forward. The saplings rattled violently as the buck veered, charging directly toward Sam's stand. In seconds, the quiet hunt turned into chaos. The massive deer slammed into the stand with brute force, the wood rattling beneath Sam's boots. He was thrown backward, his body scraping against the rough bark as he clung for balance. Pain shot across his side where sharp edges tore through his jacket. The doe and fawn scattered in panic, darting into the thicker timber, while the buck, wild with adrenaline, circled the clearing in confusion. From across the trail, Nate reacted quickly. He raised his own muzzleloader and fired, the loud crack cutting through the frosty silence. His shot did not strike, but forced the buck to hesitate, its focus breaking long enough for Sam to recover. Bloodied and bruised, Sam pulled himself upright, heart pounding in his chest as he steadied his grip once more. The clearing smelled of powder smoke and frost, the trail now marked with fresh tracks and streaks of blood. Sam climbed down slowly, each movement cautious against the lingering ache in his side. He could hear the buck crashing through the brush ahead, wounded but still strong. Gritting his teeth, he followed, every step deliberate, the frost crunching beneath his boots. 50 yards into the timber, the buck slowed, its breath ragged in the cold. Sam leveled his muzzleloader once more, lined his sights, and fired a clean shot into its chest. The crack echoed again, and the deer staggered, collapsing heavily into the frost-laden brush. Sam stood over it, his chest heaving, his body sore and scratched from the fall, but relief washed over him. The long morning had ended in survival and success, though the memory of the charging buck would remain far longer than the sting of his wounds. Sam stood in the frosty clearing, the steam from his breath mixing with the faint smoke that still lingered from the muzzleloader. His muscles ached, his side burned from the scrape, and his hands trembled not just from the cold, but from the surge of adrenaline that had coursed through him. The buck lay still on the frozen ground, its antlers half buried in frost and leaves. The forest, which only moments before had been filled with chaos, fell back into silence. Even the distant calls of birds had stopped, as if the woods themselves recognized the sudden shift from fury to calm. Nate arrived soon after, crunching across the icy brush with careful steps. He looked at his brother, battered but upright, and then at the fallen animal that had nearly ended the morning hunt in disaster. Relief mixed with shock as the two realized how quickly the calm of waiting had turned into a violent struggle. Sam wiped blood from his scraped side, each movement sharp with pain, but his eyes stayed fixed on the deer. The hunt had ended successfully, but the cost left him shaken. The men worked slowly to prepare the animal, cautious and deliberate with every cut. Frost clung to their gloves, and their breath hung thick in the air as they dressed the deer. The forest floor told the story of what had happened. Churned soil, broken saplings, streaks of blood, and the marks left where the buck had charged the stand. Every glance back at the clearing reminded them of how easily the moment could have ended differently. Once the buck was secured, they began the long haul back toward their truck. The weight pressed against their shoulders, and the cold air bit at their faces, but it was the memory of the charge that carried the heaviest burden. Each step across the icy trail echoed the thought that hunts in these woods were never guaranteed, no matter the level of preparation or experience. At camp, Sam carefully peeled back his torn jacket. Bruises darkened his ribs and shallow cuts lined his side, but none were life-threatening. Nate cleaned the scrapes with icy water, each sting reminding Sam of the stand's collapse and the force of the buck's impact. The small fire crackled nearby, offering some warmth, though its glow felt distant compared to the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. He replayed the scene again and again, the sudden flash of movement, the violent slam of the animal's body, the scramble to stay alive. By the time the deer was fully prepared and hung, the sun had dipped low, spreading pale light across the frosty valley. Other hunters passing through stopped to hear the tale, shaking their heads at the close call. Many spoke of how easily deer can become unpredictable, especially when fawns are present or when they feel cornered. Sam listened, knowing that the lesson had been carved into him more deeply than any advice could ever teach. That night, as the cold deepened and the fire burned low, Sam lay awake. The bruises throbbed, and every shift in position sent aches through his body. Yet it was not the pain that held him restless, but the knowledge of how close the line between hunter and hunted truly was. The buck had been taken. The day had ended. But the image of it charging through the frost, eyes blazing and hooves tearing the earth, would stay with him long after the wounds had healed. In September 2024, the deep forests of the Amur region in Russia lay under a heavy darkness, broken only by the faint glow of lanterns in a hunter's camp. The group of 4 men, all seasoned and skilled, had spent the day tracking game along rugged ridgelines and riverbanks. Tired yet satisfied, they returned with meat, storing it carefully near the tents. The air was cool, the forest silent except for the occasional call of an owl, and they settled in for the night. Among them was Ivan, whose teenage son Alexei rested in a smaller tent a short distance from the others. For Alexei, this trip was meant to be a lesson in the wild, a memory of time spent with his father. The night wore on, shadows stretching long across the forest floor as the fire dimmed. But in the distance another presence stirred. A massive grizzly, gaunt from the season and restless with hunger, followed the drifting scent of meat that clung to the cold air. Step by step it crept through the trees, its huge frame silent until it neared the camp. The faint lantern light glowed against its fur, and its low growl rumbled as it drew closer. Without warning, the stillness shattered. The bear lunged forward, smashing into the first tent. The thin canvas ripped like paper under the strike of its claws. Shouts rose into the night, but they were drowned by snarls and the sound of flesh tearing. One man was dragged out in an instant, his body tossed aside as the beast thrashed with furious power. Within seconds, panic consumed the camp. Another hunter grabbed for his weapon, but the bear was relentless, its bulk crashing into him before he could lift it. The air filled with screams, with canvas ripping, and with the chaos of the attack. Ivan tried desperately to fight back, but the animal was too strong, its rage unstoppable. The beast turned from one body to the next, ripping through every tent in its path. The ground shook with each violent movement, and the firelight flickered wildly, casting broken shadows on the trees. Within 2 minutes, the clearing had become a nightmare. The four hunters lay lifeless, their resistance crushed by the sheer force of the grizzly. The lantern tipped onto its side, spilling light across the forest floor. Nearby, Alexei lay frozen in his own tent, the thin walls trembling with each roar and crash outside. His heart pounded so loud he feared it would betray him. He clenched his hands around the sleeping bag, paralyzed with fear as the snarls grew closer. The bear sniffed the air, its attention drawn to the scattered supplies. A dropped backpack and the glow of the overturned lantern caught its focus. For a moment, the destruction paused, its massive head turning toward the light. The ground shook as it pawed at the objects, distracted by what seemed like weakness. In that moment, Alexei's trembling hand found the rifle his father had left near the entrance of the tent. He pulled it close, his breaths shallow and quick. Summoning every shred of courage, he opened the flap just enough to raise the barrel skyward. With his body shaking, he squeezed the trigger and the single shot cracked through the forest like thunder. The echo rolled across the valley and the grizzly froze, startled by the sudden blast. It let out a low growl, then turned, retreating slowly into the dark timber, its hulking figure fading into the shadows. Alexei was alive, but the night was far from over. The clearing fell silent after the rifle shot, the echo fading into the dense forest. Alexei lowered the weapon, his arms trembling from the weight of both fear and exhaustion. The air smelled of gunpowder, blood, and smoke, and the lantern's glow still spilled weakly across the torn camp. He remained inside the small tent for long minutes, afraid that the animal might return, every creak of the trees sounding like heavy steps. Only when the silence stretched on did he crawl out, the ground cold beneath his knees. The sight that met him was more than his young eyes could bear. The once orderly camp was nothing but wreckage. The canvas of the larger tents lay in tatters scattered across the ground. Supplies were overturned, gear flung far from its place, and claw marks scarred everything in sight. The fire had nearly died, leaving only glowing embers that gave little warmth. But it was the motionless bodies of the four men that froze him in place. His father and the others lay broken, the force of the attack clear in every detail. Alexei staggered toward Ivan, falling to his knees beside him. He reached out a trembling hand, but the stillness of his father's body gave him the truth he feared most. Tears filled his eyes, but no sound escaped his lips. In the space of a few minutes, the strong men he had trusted, the figures who had seemed unshakable, were gone. He was alone in the vast darkness, a boy with nothing but a rifle and the faint glow of a dying fire. Hours passed slowly. Alexei dragged what supplies he could salvage to the small tent, building a makeshift barrier with packs and torn canvas. His hands shook as he worked, every rustle of the trees making him glance toward the shadows. The rifle never left his reach. The forest seemed endless, each gust of wind carrying the memory of the roars that had filled it earlier. Exhaustion pulled at his body, but fear kept him alert. He did not sleep, his young mind haunted by what he had seen. Morning finally came, pale light spreading through the mist. The forest looked unchanged, but the camp bore scars that told the truth of the night. Alexei stood with stiff movements, his body aching from crouching for so long. He gathered strength and set out toward the river, knowing he needed to find help. Every step was slow, his father's rifle heavy across his shoulder. The silence of the woods pressed against him, but he kept moving, driven by the will to survive. Rescuers arrived later that day, alerted by the smoke signals Alexei had managed to set with damp branches. They found the boy pale, bloodied, and exhausted, but alive. Behind him, the camp lay ruined, a stark reminder of the violence that had unfolded. The men who examined the site spoke quietly, their faces grim as they saw the destruction left by the grizzly. In the weeks that followed, Alexei carried the weight of the night with him. Though his wounds were shallow, the memories cut far deeper. The echo of snarls, the crash of tearing canvas, and the sudden stillness of those he loved would never leave him. Officials later warned that such attacks, though rare, showed the danger of leaving food unsecured in wild country. But for Alexei, the lesson was carved not in words but in memory. The boy had survived the night of terror, yet the shadows of that September night would remain with him for the rest of his life. September 2025, the wild silence of Kodiak Island stretched across the gravel trails and salmon streams, broken only by the flowing water and the distant calls of gulls. Ryan Matthews, an experienced hunter, had risen early that morning to scan the valley for the massive boars that roamed the ridges. With binoculars in hand, he had spent hours watching the distant figures of bears moving along the riverbanks, measuring the wind and mapping his next approach. When midday came, he parked his pickup along a secluded trail, resting inside while eating a simple meal, his gear neatly stored in the back. The cab of the truck felt like a small shelter from the wilderness beyond. Ryan leaned back in his seat, the hum of the stream faint in the distance, unaware that another presence had already caught his trail. From the thick brush nearby, a Kodiak bear of immense size moved steadily toward the parked vehicle. Weighing close to 900 pounds, it had been drawn not only by the faint scent of fish, but also by the unfamiliar odor of man and food carried on the wind. Its paws pressed heavily into the earth as it closed the gap, its massive body hidden until the final approach. Without warning, the calm ended in an explosion of force. The bear slammed against the passenger side of the truck, the entire frame shuddering as metal groaned under the weight. Ryan dropped his meal as the window shattered in a spray of glass, shards scattering across the seat and floor. He scrambled to lock the doors, but the animal's claws tore into the doorframe, ripping through steel as if it were thin bark. The growl that followed vibrated through the cabin, rattling Ryan's chest with its sheer power. The paw of the beast broke through the opening, swiping with ferocity. Ryan felt searing pain tear through his arm and shoulder as claws raked across his flesh, leaving deep wounds that burned and bled instantly. The truck, meant to be a shield, had become a cage with no easy escape. Adrenaline surged as he pressed himself back against the driver's side, fumbling for control. The horn blared as his hand slammed down, its loud cry echoing across the valley. For a moment, the bear paused, but its rage was not finished. With his free hand, Ryan reached for the sidearm holstered at his waist. The weight of the weapon steadied his shaking grip as he raised it toward the gaping hole where the window had once been. The animal lunged again, its claws scraping across the dashboard and seat. Ryan fired a single round into the air, the sound deafening inside the small space. The blast of noise startled the massive creature, its ears twitching as it roared in frustration. Slowly, the bear pulled back, tearing the mangled doorframe as it retreated. It lingered for seconds that felt endless, its eyes glowing in the fractured light before finally turning toward the dark timber. Branches cracked as it vanished into the brush, leaving Ryan bleeding and gasping inside the battered vehicle. The attack had lasted less than a minute, yet the damage left behind made it feel like an eternity. Ryan sat frozen in the driver's seat, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts as the echo of the gunshot faded into the endless wild around him. The truck was quiet except for the faint ticking of the engine and the dripping of blood from his wounded arm onto the floor mat. The air reeked of smoke, sweat, and iron. His body trembled as adrenaline drained away, leaving only the sharp sting of torn flesh and the weight of what had just happened. The vehicle that had seemed strong enough to protect him now stood scarred and broken, its side twisted inward as proof of the bear's unstoppable power. Pain spread from his shoulder down to his hand, every movement a reminder of the claws that had ripped through him. He pulled a first aid kit from behind the seat, hands shaking as he tried to wrap the deep gashes with gauze. The blood soaked through quickly, but the pressure slowed the flow enough to keep him moving. He forced himself to steady his breathing, knowing that panic would only drain his strength further. The truck bore the marks of the siege. Glass shards glimmered on the seat, the dashboard was torn, and the door hung bent and useless. The horn had stopped echoing, leaving the forest eerily silent again, as if the attack had never happened. But Ryan knew better. Every shadow in the trees seemed alive now, every rustle a possible return of the massive animal that had nearly ended him. He reached for the ignition and turned the key, the engine sputtering before roaring to life, its sound bringing a measure of relief. Driving was painful. Each movement of the wheel strained the wounds in his arm and shoulder. Still, he forced the truck forward, gravel crunching under the tires as he made his way back toward camp. Every mile felt endless, his mind replaying the moment the bear broke through, the weight of its paw, and the rage in its roar. By the time he reached a gathering of guides farther down the trail, his strength was nearly gone. They rushed to his aid, pulling him from the cab and working quickly to stop the bleeding before arranging evacuation to medical help. Hours later, in the small regional clinic, Ryan's wounds were cleaned and stitched, the long slashes leaving scars that would remain as permanent reminders. His ribs were bruised from the impact, his body battered, but his life had been spared. Word of the attack spread quickly among other hunters and locals, serving as a warning that even strong vehicles will not protect a person against Kodiak bears when hunger and boldness drive them. For days after, Ryan replayed the event in his mind, the sound of tearing metal and shattering glass haunting him each time he closed his eyes. He had survived because of instinct and quick reaction, but the narrow escape left him humbled. Guides later stressed to others that the strength of a Kodiak could turn steel into scrap within seconds, and that caution, awareness, and preparation were the only shields against such force. The gravel road where it had all happened remained unchanged, the forest returning to silence as if nothing had occurred. Yet for Ryan, the marks on his body and the twisted frame of his truck told a different story, one of survival, fear, and respect for a predator whose power could never be underestimated. In late November 2021, the rolling hills of Tuscany were damp and heavy with the smell of wet leaves and flooded earth. Along the edge of a soaked cornfield, 10 hunters lined a narrow ridge, each positioned with care as guides and beaters worked the thick woods below. Their voices echoed faintly through the chestnut and oak stands, rattling branches and striking sticks together to push the wild boars from their hidden cover. The men on the ridge, dressed in layered camouflage and tall waterproof boots, gripped their rifles tightly, eyes fixed on the fields ahead. The wet ground made every step cautious, and the cold air pressed against their lungs as anticipation built. At the center of the line stood Luca Romano, an experienced hunter who carried a 9.3 x62 Enlemire rifle topped with a telescopic scope. Years of stalking game across Tuscany had sharpened his instincts, and he moved with the steady calm of someone who understood both the rewards and dangers of such hunts. His eyes scanned the reeds that swayed under the weight of water, searching for the faintest flicker of movement. For him and the others, discipline was everything. Each man had to trust the hunters beside him to hold their ground and react without hesitation. The first hint of chaos came as reeds parted violently near the far end of the line. A low rumble of hooves on wet soil grew louder, and shouts from the beaters carried warnings forward. Out of the dense cover burst a massive kyler, a dominant male wild boar weighing more than 200 kilograms. Its bristled coat glistened with mud, tusks curved and sharp from years of fighting. Startled and enraged by the drive, it charged headlong toward the waiting ridge, its eyes fixed with fury on the line of hunters. Luca steadied his rifle, heart pounding as the animal closed the distance faster than he could track. Before he could fire, the beast slammed into him with bone-crushing force. The impact knocked him sideways, his jacket ripped to shreds as tusks scraped across his chest and arm. He hit the ground hard, the rifle slipping from his grasp as mud splashed around him. The keeler did not stop. It plowed into the two hunters beside him, one man's forearm fracturing under the collision, another spinning to the ground with bruises spreading across his side. The line erupted in gunfire as hunters fired controlled shots into the cornfield, trying to stop the animal's rampage. Muzzles flashed, smoke rose in the damp air, and the sound of bullets cracked against reeds and earth. The keeler staggered but pushed forward still, its body fueled by raw strength and rage. Hunters adjusted, stepping sideways to avoid its path as it crashed deeper through the corn, water, and mud spraying behind it. At last, after a barrage of rounds, the animal veered away, retreating into a dense hedgerow at the far end of the clearing. The sounds of snapping branches echoed until silence returned, leaving only the heavy breaths of the wounded men and the faint shouts of beaters calling from below. 4 hunters lay bloodied and shaken, their bodies marked by tusks, hooves, and the sheer weight of the keeler's charge. The once orderly ridge now looked like a battlefield, proof of how quickly discipline and order could be torn apart by a single furious animal. The ridge fell quiet after the last echo of gunfire faded into the damp forest. Steam rose from the churned soil where the keeler had broken through, and the smell of mud, sweat, and smoke hung heavy in the cold air. Luca lay on his side, gasping as pain spread through his ribs and shoulder. His shredded jacket clung to torn skin, and dark stains spread across the wet ground beneath him. Around him, the other hunters moved quickly, some checking their rifles while others rushed to aid the men who had been struck by the charging animal. One hunter clutched his arm, the bone visibly bent beneath the sleeve of his jacket. Another winced as he struggled to stand, his body stiff with bruises from the collision. Their breaths came in sharp bursts, eyes still wide from the suddenness of the attack. Luca pressed his palm to his chest, steadying himself as his heartbeat pounded in his ears. He pushed himself upright, teeth gritted against the searing pain. His rifle lay in the mud a few feet away, its stock cracked from the fall. The guides descended from the lower slope, their faces drawn tight with concern as they surveyed the chaos. They moved between the injured, applying bandages where they could and helping those who could still walk toward the trail. The hunters who had avoided harm stood in silence, their weapons still at the ready in case the boar returned. Every rustle of brush drew their eyes, each sound carrying the threat of another charge. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the reality of the attack settled in. The ridge that had been so carefully organized now lay scattered, with broken gear, dropped cartridges, and trampled reeds marking the path of the furious animal. For the men who stood there, the hunt was no longer about skill or harvest. It had turned into survival. The Kyler had retreated, but the fear of its return lingered like a shadow over every step. The group began the slow process of retreating from the ridge, helping the wounded toward safer ground. Luca leaned heavily against one of the guides, his body trembling from exhaustion and shock. Each step sent pain shooting through his ribs, but he forced himself forward. Behind them, the forest was quiet once again, as though the land had swallowed the chaos whole. By the time they reached the vehicles, the light was fading, and frost clung to the edges of the cornfield. The hunters loaded their injured companions carefully, the silence broken only by strained breaths and the occasional groan of pain. The Kyler was gone, but its memory hung over them, heavier than the chill in the air. In the days that followed, the men replayed the attack in their minds, each remembering how quickly the line had fallen into chaos. For Luca, the scars on his chest and arms would remain as permanent reminders of how a single moment could turn order into disaster. Guides later gathered the hunters to emphasize again the risks of line drives, warning that spacing, discipline, and readiness were the only defenses against the raw power of a dominant boar. Though the wounds healed with time, the memory of that November morning did not fade. The ridge, once seen as a place of strategy and teamwork, would forever be remembered as the ground where control was shattered by fury and survival was earned through luck and instinct. In late October 2023, the rugged canyons of remote Colorado were filled with crisp air and fading autumn light. Hunter Tyler Hayes and his 14-year-old son Mason had set up a ground blind along a rocky ridge that overlooked a narrow canyon. They had prepared carefully for the elk season, carrying scent-blocking spray, wearing layered camouflage, and keeping both a .270 rifle and a backup sidearm within reach. For hours, Tyler used calls and branch rattling to try and draw a bull elk into the open, while Mason scanned the shadowed slopes with his binoculars. The ridge was silent except for the occasional rustle of wind against dry branches, and both remained patient, knowing the fading daylight often brought movement. As the minutes passed, the stillness of the timber seemed almost too heavy. Tyler noticed a faint flicker of movement below, not the steady shape of an elk, but something quicker and more deliberate. The air shifted, carrying an unease that prickled at the edges of his awareness. Mason leaned forward, his binoculars focusing, but before either could react further, a powerful form leapt from a rock ledge. Out of the gathering shadows came a massive mountain lion, its muscles coiled and its eyes locked onto its prey. The predator lunged directly toward Mason with terrifying speed, its claws flashing in the dim light. The boy was thrown backward, his leg and shoulder torn as the animal's weight drove into him. The sound of his cry echoed sharply through the canyon, breaking the silence of the evening. Tyler reacted instantly, raising the rifle and forcing his body into control despite the chaos around him. He squeezed the trigger, the recoil jarring his shoulder as the shot rang out. The bullet struck the lion's shoulder, spinning it slightly but not stopping its rage. The predator circled them, hissing and growling, its tail lashing through the brush. Mason struggled to sit up, blood seeping through his torn clothing, his face pale with pain. Tyler reloaded quickly, eyes fixed on the animal as it paced, waiting for another chance. The tension stretched tight, every breath thick with fear. Finally, the lion retreated into the dense brush, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. The echoes of its growls faded into the canyon, leaving behind silence once more, broken only by Mason's gasps. The rocky ridge that had seemed like a good vantage point only hours before was now marked with blood and fear. Tyler gripped his rifle, his heart pounding, knowing that even with preparation, danger had arrived faster than he could have imagined. The ridge grew eerily still after the predator slipped back into the timber, but the damage it left behind was clear. Mason lay trembling on the rocky ground, his shirt torn and stained with blood. His leg and shoulder bore deep claw marks, and the sharp impact had left him struggling to move his arm. Tyler kept his rifle steady, scanning the tree line for any sign of the animal's return, every rustle of leaves carrying the weight of fear. The shadows thickened as night pressed in, and the canyon seemed to close around them with silence heavier than before. Tyler quickly turned to his son, ripping strips of cloth to press against the wounds. Each touch drew a wince, but Mason stayed still, his eyes wide and filled with shock. The fractured collarbone made even small movements painful, yet he fought to remain calm as his father worked. The brush behind them remained dark and silent, but neither trusted that the danger was truly gone. With limited supplies, Tyler fashioned a makeshift bandage and steadied Mason against him. He knew they could not wait for daylight, as the risk of the lion circling back was too great. They climbed down the ridge slowly and brutally, each step cautious on the uneven rocks, the weight of his injured son dragging heavily at his side. The cold air bit at their skin, adding to the strain of the descent. At last, they reached the trail where an outfitter's vehicle waited. Mason was lifted carefully inside, his face pale, his breath shallow from pain and exhaustion. The ride to safety felt endless, but the headlights cutting through the night finally brought relief. Hours later, surgeons worked to close the wounds and set the broken bone, while Tyler sat nearby, his mind replaying the ambush over and over. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly through the hunting community. Guides stressed that mountain lions, with their silence and speed, could strike even when hunters were armed and alert. For Tyler and Mason, the rocky ridge would never again be a place of calm. It would remain the site where shadows turned into fury, and survival had come at the cost of scars that would last a lifetime.